Hi, everyone. I'm David Graham. I'm a staff writer here at The Atlantic. Welcome to The Big Story. What's at stake this midterm election? Thanks for being here. I want to welcome my colleagues, journalists Mark Leibovich and Elaina Plott, two of the best political writers in the country. You may know their writing here. You may know their writing from a small regional paper in New York, where they've both written, or from Mark's best-selling books. And Elaina has a sure-to-be best-selling book coming up soon that you will want to pick up. But today we are going to talk a little bit about the elections, the thing at hand, which is the elections. We'll chat for a little bit and then we'll take some audience questions. So be sure to drop those in the chat and we'll get to that in a little bit. Mark and Elaina, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us, David.
So let's start with an easy softball question. Who's going to win these midterm elections and by how much? Mark, tell us, who's going to win? What's going to happen?
Republicans win the House by 16 seats, and it will be 50-50 in the Senate. There we go.
Perfect. We're all done.
We're done.
Thank you. No.
Elaina,
what do you think?
That's in line with you, right?
I think the same. I think if anything, I could see Republicans winning the Senate with one seat. Yeah. 51-49.
I think there's this weird thing that happens when we watch midterm elections and over the course of a few months where you can feel the news cycles happening either because there is a change in momentum or because people like us desperately have to create narratives. So, we had this Democratic doom narrative in the spring, and then after Dobbs, there was a question mark, and then we had the sort of dark Brandon comeback. We seem to be back in a moment where Republicans are regaining more momentum and more upper hand. How do you, as professionals at this, sort through what is narrative and what is noise and what's actually happening and try to track the real course of the election?
I guess I'll take a crack at that first. I mean, narrative is noise. It really is. I mean, we have found so repeatedly over the last few cycles that polling has just really failed miserably, like cycle and cycle over and over and over again. And there's no real model for Trump. There's no really good solid polling model for Trump. This is really the first time. I mean, it's the first national election since January 6th, since Biden's been in office. But also, the polling has been very unreliable and all over the map since the Dobbs decision. So in a way, you have the unreliability of polls. People are just surprised over and over again, and then they're surprised again over and over again. I mean, after the Kansas referendum, which shockingly, voted against a statewide, ban on abortion, basically. People were shocked. And yet then it happened again in Alaska. The polling reflects that. Then all of a sudden, because other news events are intervening, people assume that, abortion has receded because maybe it's kind of fallen back in a few polls. But again, I mean, none of this is even remotely scientific, in so much as that polling in this day and age is even remotely scientific. So I don't know. I am in a sort of personal war against certainty in my own head and trying to ignore things that try to pass itself off as certainty in the days leading up to this race.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I feel like the sort of savvy news consumers have learned over the last 15 or 20 years, you don't trust one poll, don't trust the outliers, look to the polling averages. So, make sure you're on 538 or Real Clear Politics, and you'll be able to discern what's really happening. But if that's not true, what should people be paying attention to try to understand the world around them?
So I have blacklisted essentially the phrase in my own lexicon, could emerge as. I feel like that's what happens in the aftermath of so many really newsy, noisy events. And I mean that in kind of a value neutral way, but when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I can't tell you how many stories I read where it talked about how abortion could emerge as a key deciding factor in the midterm elections. It's that way really with anything big or small that at least momentarily drives the news cycle. And I think whether you're a reporter or a reader, I think you should only be looking at stories where it's clear that the reporter has actually gone to the district in question, actually gone to the state in question, and talked to voters about what is actually emerging as a key issue in the race. Because that's really, as Mark said, with polling, predictive models have just taken such a hit credibility-wise, as has the phrase with reporters. Whatever seems could emerge is not necessarily the thing that emerges. So I think what we have seen as the actual election has gotten closer is more reporters actually going out into the field and talking to people about what is sort of dictating the thing they'll be thinking about in the ballot box, which is why I think you see a resurgence of stories about inflation all of a sudden. I don't think that happened accidentally. I think when you read those stories, it's because the narrative, so to speak, or the point of the story is being derived from what an actual voter is saying.
When we see that, there were predictions that inflation would kind of drive this election earlier on. It receded from the news, if not from voters' consciousness for a while, and it's now back. I mean, should we just be, especially in the absence of polling, should we just be looking at economic indicators to understand where this election is going, or any midterm? I mean, is that really what it boils down to? Is we should just check gas prices and the unemployment rate?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think traditionally, historically, economic indicators have been tip of the spear. I mean, they have been, election after election, that is always sort of listed as number one, but it also has been the most predictive. However, again, there are these other X factors in this election, and even in the last election. I mean, Donald Trump had a terrible economy to run on. In addition to all of his other problems, I mean, the November 2000 or the November 2020 economy was a terrible handicap for him, as was COVID. I mean, obviously the two were hand in hand, but people forget that Trump overperformed. He certainly overperformed polls. The Republican House overperformed in a big way. And the Democratic Senate, which ultimately, wound up 50-50, was also an underperformance on the part of the Democrats because, Trump sort of personally coughed up the two Georgia seats. But also, Susan Collins was said to be very vulnerable. Tom Tillis in North Carolina was said to be very vulnerable. And, there are individual sort of vicissitudes to those races, in North Carolina in particular. But, ultimately, this is with a bad economy for Republicans, and yet they still kind of overperformed there, or overperformed 2020. But then there are other X factors in the other direction now. One, again, being abortion. The other being, you don't really know how January 6th is going to play as a ballot issue. I mean, people just assume that, okay, that's in the past. People don't, people are worried about the state of democracy, but they're not going to vote on it. There was a story, I guess, in the Times the other day that said as much. So again, there are these X factors that we don't really have a good historical precedent to sort of study as what it might mean and how it could affect, the overriding issue, which I think is going to be the economy and certainly inflation.
I would add to that, David, if it's okay.
Please.
I would actually argue that there is something we know in the sense that American politics has taken on so much more of an existential tinge for both parties. So even if you are, often I have felt this, talking to a Democratic voter who tends to lean pretty left and is hurting from inflation pretty badly and can kind of enumerate the ways that it is affecting them, they might still plan to vote Democratic because the idea is that Republicans are such an existential threat to the state of the country. But the same goes for Republicans. I mean, Republicans, January 6th aside, everything else aside, believe that Democratic control really will be the end of this nation. And so at a certain point, viewed through that lens, the price of milk starts to seem kind of like just the details, and not really the firmament of what's driving people in the polls at the end of the day. Well, things are bad now, which I think is part of what may have happened in 2018. Republicans saying, even if the economy is not great right now, it's a do or die time right now. You simply can't give a hand to the other guy and see if he has a chance of making it better.
I mean, how does that manifest? Does that mean people, they don't defect from their team, so to speak? Does it mean that you get voters who are unwilling to cross the aisle but might just stay home? What does that turn into in practice?
I think a lot of it is staying home, actually. And I think that is what the Biden administration is probably more worried about than most things, at least according to two White House officials I've spoken to. That things with, student debt cancellation, a lot of that, I mean, implicitly, or maybe even explicitly, is about ensuring people actually go vote. Again, the dichotomy there is not whether they will drift Republican if they don't have any kind of incentive in this way for Democrats. It's just that they don't, head out that day and cast a vote for anyone.
I mean, I think this idea that people are convinced that every election is sort of the end of the world if their party loses is so important. And I'm wondering, both of you, I hope I'm not doxing you, Mark, to say you've been working on this a little bit longer than Elaina, but over the course of your careers, I mean, even from 2016 to 2020 to 2022, how have you seen that change in the way voters tell you how they feel about stories and about elections?
Well, I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, first of all, that has been true for a while. I mean, normally, I would say until 2016, we could all kind of roll our eyes and make fun of how commonly people will say this is the most important election of our lifetime. But there is a very convincing argument to be made that 2016 was perhaps the most important election of our lifetime, and then 2020. So far, well, 2020. I mean, I don't know.
David's ready to have fun.
No, I mean, it's true. I mean, I've done many kind of cheeky pieces about, oh, look, Dick Gephardt says that, 2004 is by far the most important. I mean, really, it happens. You can Google that. That happened. The phrase comes. But I mean, part of it is noise. Part of it's kind of a turnout technique for the parties. Part of it is not noise, though. I mean, I actually think that this is, the apocalyptic talk from both sides, but really start with Trump and sort of in conjunction with Trump, sort of look at what Fox News broadcasts every single night. I mean, they are selling existential threats, essentially. They are selling crime as an existential threat. I mean, I was on a plane the other day and I happened to watch Fox for a few hours, and it was prime time. And it was basically 3 consecutive hours of crime and a lot of video of, frankly, a lot of African-American, crime, black on white crime. I mean, it's just one after another. It's much more openly sort of, racial than it used to be, much more, anti-Semitic, as we've seen. So, in a way, the language, the sort of barriers of responsibility that public people, whether they're in politics or in the media, used to adhere to, have kind of fallen off. And that was, I think that's partly a Trump phenomenon. And I remember when I was writing the book that I just put out, Mitt Romney said that one of the things that struck him about watching Trump is that the first thing you learn in politician school is, figurative politician school, is don't say something that is going to inflame the random nut out there. Someone who could potentially commit violence, someone who could potentially do something really wacky and give them any ideas, essentially. Trump never got that memo. But again, I think the kind of apocalyptic rhetoric and behavior that we have seen, and I think it starts in a large way with Fox and the right, but I also think that is echoed in the other direction. And whoever's to blame, I think that has sort of become a fact of our political rhetoric these days.
Elaina, I wanted to jump back to something you said a moment ago. You're talking about turnout, and we see Democrats sort of trying to spotlight abortion on to drive turnout among their voters. What do you see this? How do you see abortion playing among Republican voters? Because we've seen Republican politicians split. We've seen some trying to downplay abortion as an issue. We've seen others, sort of going all out and saying, "Great, we've overturned Roe. Now it's time for a full ban or something closer to a full national ban." Where are voters on this? What is it going to do to their decisions in I guess just a couple weeks?
Well, I think one rather easy metric by which you can kind of judge this is seeing people who had previously positioned themselves as extremely far right on issues on abortion, like Blake Masters in Arizona. They reached the general election and suddenly they're scrubbing their website of all testaments to how nobody is more purely pro-life than they are. Well, Blake, I would say there might be one other person if you are not willing to put it on the website anymore. But I feel like there are multiple examples of things like that. I mean, this always happens, right? In primaries, get into a general election, you start to soften your stance on a variety of things. But I have not seen it to a degree, kind of this blatant as I have with abortion and some of these Republican candidates. Just this softening, indicating and understanding that a national ban on abortion is not going to send either Democrats or Republicans writ large flocking to the ballot box to vote for you. So I would say that I don't know that there is a huge segment of Republican women who would be moved to switch to a Democratic candidate on the issue of abortion, unless the candidate in question has resolutely, not committed to softening their stance at all. But you have to remember too that, people vote in their own interest, and there are still states in America where abortion remains legally protected. So I think this conversation, you either have to be talking very specifically about what women in Texas are thinking, as opposed to what American women in the Republican Party are saying about abortion.
Can we draw conclusions about, we've had a lot of focus on suburban women in the last few cycles as a group that, switched over towards Democrats in some cases. Can we draw any conclusions about how they might vote based on abortion, or is that also just too generalized to really say?
I would err toward it being too generalized to say, but I would also say that I mentioned to you that I wanted to talk about Nevada. For some reason, from the start of my career, I've always had a fascination with the state of Nevada and its politics. But right now you have Catherine Cortez Masto, the incumbent, running against Adam Laxalt. So he's the former Attorney General of Nevada. He's a Republican, long line of Nevadan politicians. And Adam Laxalt has never quite gotten to the level that he's wanted, despite many, many attempts at it. But this might just be the time that he can, in fact, get on Capitol Hill. And the reason I say that is that Catherine Cortez Masto for a while went all in on abortion. I mean, that was the subject of so many of her campaign ads and just so much of sort of the narrative of her operation. And it just wasn't working. And she has tried to change tax, I think, as we get closer to the election. And it's clear that for Nevada voters, something like inflation is more salient. But the reason I say that is Nevada is one of those states where abortion remains legally protected. And so the suburban women who live there, certainly, or Republican women who live there, who might otherwise be worried about an issue like abortion if they lived in a state like Texas, it's not, again, people vote on what matters to them immediately, most immediately. And that's just not going to be, I think, top of mind for suburban women in those cases when they vote in November.
So we've talked about abortion, we've talked about inflation in the economy, we've talked about crime. I want to talk about the sort of the big Trump elephant in the room in a moment. But before we do that, are there other issues that you see maybe not getting the attention they deserve in coverage, or are those sort of the big three?
Okay, so the big three being what's it? Abortion, the economy, inflation, or Trump
And crime. Yeah.
crime. Okay, got it. I mean, look, this might be a personal interest, and this is proof that you should never listen to a political reporter or anything because we're so out of touch. But I do like to think that enough voters out there, a critical mass of voters out there, care enough about democracy, about election denialism, non-peaceful transfers of power, the rule of law. I mean, things that have been flouted left and right. And I, if that makes me sound partisan or sort of wary of Trump as an issue or Trump as a potential menace in the next election or in this, in a few weeks or in the day-to-day life of our country, so be it. But I wouldn't completely dismiss the idea that Republicans haven't really presented an alternative to what is a very, very compelling story they have, which is that the Democrats are screwing up a lot. I mean, whether it's actually true or not, I mean, a lot of people believe it. It's reflected in the Democrats' approval and Biden's approval and so forth, and confidence in the direction of the country. But Republicans don't have an issue they're running on, except that we're not Biden, we're not Democrats, we're not socialists, and we're the alternative. But they still don't have a party platform, and so forth. So I don't know. I would like to think that we shouldn't underestimate the just incredible time we lived through in January of 2021 and those months where as someone who's been living here for a quarter century and covering this stuff for a long time, has never felt more precarious. And frankly, as you go out and cover some of these Republican races and how, again, just the fiction of the 2020 election and the just the sort of sweeping away of January 6th and even things like vaccine denialism, to me, that could be, or I would hope that would be a large piece of why people vote for, someone who does not subscribe to that kind of, those many flavors of denialism, let's say.
I appreciate your optimism. Oh, go ahead, Elaina. Yeah.
I wanted to add to that quickly, because it's not just kind of January 6th and hoping that voters do, remember what happened there and the implications and how they kind of flow into today. I mean, Republicans really have made that part of the firmament of their party at this point. It's not just something that has kind of existed in the ether since January 6th. I mean, that's why I think this is probably the first midterm election ever where I have been distinctly paying attention to Secretary of State races, because you do have Stefan Passantino, former White House counsel, who has created something called the SOS for America PAC, I think. And the sole purpose of it is to field pro-Trump election denying candidates to become Secretary of State, to kind of take control of election machinery. And I think Mark is absolutely right. There is no kind of positive message that's attached to the GOP right now. There hasn't been for a long time. Oddly enough, it is this desire to, really kind of take control of election machinery that I think has probably been the one forward-looking actual plank in a platform for Republicans in a long time. So, I don't think it's actually just about voters going in and sort of hoping they paid attention to the coverage of the January 6th hearings or, remember what it felt like seeing unfold on TV. I mean, it's still in many ways, the implications of that are very real around voters right now in a lot of these states, and especially Nevada, where Jim Marchant is kind of like the champion of this Stefan Passantino PAC that wants to field these candidates. So it doesn't take a lot of looking for voters to see the ways in which this has become kind of ingrained into the firmament of the GOP.
Yeah. And I mean, state legislative races are another thing that are getting more national attention this year because the stakes in terms of election administration are so high. I mean, if Jim Marchant wins, or if we see Matt DePerno win in Michigan, for example. How much should we freak out about the state of American elections if we see these sort of so-called election denying candidates win Secretary of State jobs?
I guess I'll say, well, also just by way of balance, I don't care about Nevada at all. I give that to no, actually, I care about Nevada, but no, I'm not gonna try to
We're
steal.
diverse here at the Atlantic.
No, I know we are. I care a lot about Michigan. I went to college there.
Represent all views.
No, go blue, right? No, no. Look, these are extreme. I wouldn't freak out about anything. We shouldn't freak out. We need to, if you're appalled by something, you should do something about it. Freaking out is not always productive, but
that's like the most important thing anyone will say, I think, today is don't panic about anything, do something about it. That's a great lesson.
It's kind of inspiring, Mark. Wow.
Yeah. It's really amazing. I mean, I was like thought of this cynic like 10 years ago, which I came to very honestly, but I've become, in a very inverse kind of way, a patriot, because the peril that we've seen in recent years has made me so patriotic and made me care so much more and much less flip than I used to be. And that sounds much more earnest than I planned to be, but and personal. But it's actually true. I mean, I do think. I mean, and actually, sort of to bring this back to what we're talking about is. Kevin McCarthy in recent days, right? I mean, first of all, what would it say about the Republican Party if, Herschel Walker could just sort of walk into the U.S. Senate and then all of a sudden he's like everyone's colleague, right? Every Republican's colleague, and who knows what they would say about him privately, but, he's on the team. What have you?
What would they say?
What's that?
What would they say?
I would say that, I hate this expression because it was used so much, especially on social media during the Trump years. But, that's a vote for the Nothing Matters caucus, right? That is a vote for, there are no ramifications for anything. And Kevin McCarthy in the last few days has given some really stunning interviews, I think mostly with Punchbowl over a few days. And he basically said, yeah, we're going to mess with we're probably going to mess with the debt ceiling, the debt limit. He's basically saying, and there was a very smart essay, and it was either in the Atlantic or the Bulwark, and I should know this because I work at the Atlantic. But it's very smart. You should, but no, basically Kevin McCarthy saying we are going to, the single biggest concern people have is the economy, and we are going to throw the economy into even greater turmoil by messing with the debt limit, once we get power. I mean, to me, not a good message, maybe an honest message, but the kind of thing that I'm guessing, was not a helpful thing to say, but it might not matter, right? I mean, people, might not sort of put two and two together, and I don't know how people are more closely are reading Punchbowl to see, what Kevin McCarthy might have in store as our next Speaker of the House. But I mean, that stuff is real, and that stuff could have real ramifications. And, this isn't just some kind of, I'm not trying to like lecture, the indifference of the American voter. I mean, that's not what this is about, but it's like, none of this does seem to be registering in a way, or might not be registering that I think matches the gravity of what is behind it.
I mean, is it LOL nothing matters, or is it, as Elaina's saying, simply that people think that if the other team wins, it's going to be apocalyptic, and so they're willing to suck it up and vote for Herschel Walker, even if they think he's unqualified, because look at what the other guys might do.
Yes, 1,000% for Republicans.
Yeah, I would say it's a form of LOL nothing matters. I mean, what you just laid out, right?
So Mark, let me keep skewering your newfound earnestness and optimism. I mean,
Sure.
You say hope that the Republicans and American voters in general sort of recognize this, but you wrote this great piece when you went out to cover Liz Cheney's primary, where she ultimately got massacred. What did you learn from covering that race, and what have you taken away from that for the rest of this election?
It was thoroughly depressing. It was look, Liz Cheney, I think, has been such a rare profile in, it's a cliche, but profile in courage. I mean, she has spoken not only the truth, but her truth, right? I mean, what's interesting is that most of or a great number of Republicans in Congress who are running for re-election or running for election in the Senate, I don't think have the conviction. I mean, they have similar conviction. They don't have convictions. They have similar views on, whether the election was legitimate, whether Donald Trump is, worthy of the office, and so forth. So, no, I mean, going out to Wyoming, I mean, just talking to enough voters, it was clear the way that was going. I mean, it wasn't just polls. It was, I mean, that is the default sensibility of the Republican Party now. And, you know, the thing that was really striking to me in that reporting trip was that Liz Cheney just said, like, look, this is a sick party. You know, I am a member of a sick party, which is quite a word, by the way. I mean, it's kind of a Trump word, but she actually means it in a different way. I mean, she means, like, you can't reason with this party. You know, this is not a party that I understand. And it is a party that, you know, might be on a path to nothing recognizable, or might be there already. But whatever it is, it doesn't have room for Liz Cheney. And look, it's very easy to disparage her if you're in the Republican Party today. Say, oh, well, look, she lost, right? You know, she just wants attention, and she just wants a CNN or MSNBC contract or something like that. You know, I like to think that if there were 10 Liz Cheneys in the Republican Party, or 15 Liz Cheneys, it would make a huge difference, because at least there would be an argument. But right now, there's not even an argument, you know, in any kind of critical way within the GOP.
Elaina, you talked a little bit about Nevada. I'm curious, before we go to Q&A here, I want to ask each of you if there's one, in your case, one other or one race that is most fascinating to you this time around, or the one you're watching, either just because of interpersonal dynamics or because of what it might tell us about the state of politics or the country. Is there a race like that for you, Elaina?
Yeah, and we've mentioned it already, but I would say Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock in Georgia. And one reason I am really interested in that race is because I remember, I'm sure you guys do, the Alabama Senate election in which Roy Moore ran against Doug Jones. And the reason I think there's a lot of lessons in that race and what happened there for what could happen in Georgia is that, you know, Roy Moore, talk about October surprises. I mean, he had a flurry of them, just a lot of surprise and bad surprises, just really actively bad ones. I mean, this was someone for whom multiple women either went on the record or, you know, spoke candidly to reporters, even without using their name, about times that he had molested them when they were underage. And, you know, there was a part of me, though, that still actually felt pretty confident that he would win the election, the general election against Doug Jones, the Democrat. I mean, certainly in my lifetime, I actually really cannot remember when there was a Democratic senator in Alabama, maybe Howell Heflin. I should know that off the top of my head. But anyway, I was not prepared actually for Doug Jones to win that, in spite of everything. But when it ended up happening, and what I think a misconception has been, is that what really fueled his victory was a lot of disenchanted Republicans who said, you know what? The right thing to do here is to vote for Doug Jones. I think there were, in fact, a number of Republicans who did do that. But the reason he did win is because you had Democratic voters who traditionally had just not bothered to show up come election day because it's Alabama, and, you know, really, why would you? So you had coalitions of, say, Black voters and Black women in particular, who turned out in droves, just compared to previous elections. And it was that was sort of the wave on which Doug Jones was able to get into the Senate, which is to say that I think the wrong question in some ways to ask is how many Republican voters are going to defect from Herschel Walker because of, you know, whatever craziness has emerged. I would say that I think the more salient question is how many traditionally Democratic voters in Georgia who, you know, may otherwise sit out elections will be moved because of his transgressions or whatever to get out and vote for Warnock.
Great.
Mark, what about you? What's your race?
I would say two, Ohio and Florida. And the reason I say those two states is because, you know, the conventional wisdom is that, you know, Ohio is going to vote Republican because that's where they've been trending, you know, pretty decisively in the last few cycles, and Florida too, right? However, I think what that does a disservice to is how good of a candidate Tim Ryan has been for Democrats, and Val Demings has been for Democrats. I think J.D. Vance hasn't run a great race in Ohio, and Marco Rubio in Florida, a little bit vulnerable. I think that Demings has run a good race against him. I'm not predicting an upset in either state, but what I do think is significant is if there were an upset, there is another Democratic senator in Ohio, Sherrod Brown. So there is precedent for that. There was a Democrat a few years ago, Bill Nelson in Florida. It's not, with Trump not on the ballot, Ohio and Florida are very different states, right? So I do think that those races don't get enough attention as potential flips for Democrats. And I think what's also significant about it is if they do flip for, somehow, I think Ryan and Demings or Demings immediately become national figures, in a way that Democrats desperately need. I mean, they need sort of new blood. I mean, both, to my knowledge, are under 70, there might be even under 60, right? I mean, so, John, it's amazing, right? John Fetterman, I'd probably put in that category too. He's the Democratic nominee and lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. Although, his race is a little bit hard to sort of talk about in the same context because he had a stroke a couple months ago and he hasn't really been out much. And there's been a fair amount of controversy about whether he's been forthcoming about it. He hasn't really performed much on the campaign trail. He's clearly been deficited by it. It's unclear, as it always is with brain injuries, how he will come back from this. But, on paper, a very compelling candidate and was very successful for a while. And Dr. Oz, who's the Democratic or the Republican opponent, who was a big Trump guy, has run kind of an uneven race also. So I've answered your question with 3 states.
That's great. We covered a bunch. I love that. Well, the Ryan thing is a great segue, I think, to some of the questions we're getting. And partly we've seen Tim Ryan complaining publicly the last couple of days that he feels like he should be getting more help from national Democrats and that he could flip with the right assistance. But he's not sure he's getting it. And we're getting a lot of questions about Democratic strategy. So, Susan asked, Republicans seem to be making strategic moves for a long-range plan. Democrats don't seem to do that. Why is there a lack of that long-term strategy? Why aren't Democratic commercials hitting Republicans harder on things like cuts to Medicare and Social Security? Why don't the Democrats get better communications to get the messaging as focused as Republicans are? Are these critiques fair? Are the Democrats as feckless as they often can seem and as we in the media sometimes portray them?
So when I was at a New York regional paper recently, I did write a piece sort of about this very real phenomenon that I think members of both parties believe that they are part of the party that never fights back, that just kind of cowers and lets the other party beat up on them relentlessly. So I would talk to Democratic voters for this piece who would say, I don't understand why Chuck Schumer can't be like Mitch McConnell. Why are we bringing a butter knife to an AK-47 fight, essentially? But then the reverse, I hear Republicans say it all the time, that I talk to family members back home, we don't play the game like Democrats do. Or we're not willing to say break laws or things like that. Not true, but that is the mentality that circulates among members of both parties. So I don't think there's ever going to be, kind of a good academic answer to why is it that Republicans seem so much more focused? I really do think it's this kind of like hall of mirrors thing where it just depends on, who's in the room at the time doing the looking, because, everybody seems to feel this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say I agree with Elaina, but I also think, I don't think Republicans have a long-term plan. I think they have a plan for November 8th. I mean, I think, I don't think they're looking beyond that at all. And they've been strategic in sort of trying to save Pennsylvania, trying to save Georgia. They put a lot of money behind Blake Matt. Well, actually JD Vance in Ohio, because that's a state they can ill afford to lose. And it seems like Ryan hasn't gotten a commensurate amount of support from Democrats at all, which, as you said, he's complained about. But look, I mean, as a general rule, it's much easier to run as an opposition party, and Republicans, they don't control any of the three chambers now, and are basically just opposing socialism and crime. I mean, everything that's bad that they perceive happening now, they're just sort of pinning it on Joe Biden and the Democrats and the socialists and so forth. And the only thing that, I mean, they have a lot to defend and a lot to answer for, but they have sort of they've chosen not to, right? Because if they're going to go on local TV or Fox or something like that, they're not going to be asked about, what did you think of what Donald Trump said today about, whatever. So, it's easier to run as an opposition party.
I would also add quickly, I really do sympathize with the impetus for the question, like we were just asked. And the reason is that I think Roe v. Wade and the overturning of it sparked a lot of kind of articles and chatter about how, Republicans have been, covertly kind of plotting toward this exact outcome for, 50 years now. And this has been a plan kind of long in the making. And finally, here it is. And I would talk to Democratic voters who said, what are we doing to that effect on our side? But I think that there's a pretty important distinction there between the actual Republican Party and, say, the outside groups that have been the ones who have been kind of working toward the overturn of Roe v. Wade. The Republicans themselves, like on Capitol Hill, haven't been working for 50 years toward anything, as Mark said. I mean, there's truly nothing at all. I mean, it's always been this to a degree, but especially right now, if you want to talk about Republicans seeming focused, certainly in my career, they've never seemed more reactive just in terms of everything they do. I mean, Mr. Potato Head, I think, was revealed to maybe be without gender. And that, became the, animating force of the party for, I think, 4 straight weeks and maybe even after. So it's almost like just throwing whatever at the wall and seeing what sticks. But I will say the only kind of definitive thing I've heard, and Mark kind of mentioned this about the interviews Kevin McCarthy has given Punchbowl, where he says, we do have a plan to mess with the debt limit. Over the course of working on this story on Marjorie Taylor Greene, I mean, she and kind of others in her ilk, who McCarthy takes very, very seriously now, by the way, they really actually want to focus on investigations if and when they take the House. I mean, that McCarthy went to Pennsylvania to kind of unveil the conference's commitment to America. And it all sounded really nice. He had the microphone. He was looking at, these nice, normal people who had gathered in this factory to, hear him talk about how what they're going to do is focus on you and what your problems are, and making sure that this is a party that's responsive to you. But in fact, what seems to actually be kind of circulating in the conference is a desire immediately to take power and proceed to impeach Joe Biden. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that. Marjorie Taylor Greene very much wants to proceed with either impeachment or some sort of investigation into Joe Biden. And I think Kevin McCarthy very likely will give her the leeway to do that because she raises more money than anyone else in the Republican Party at this point. And she will get the committees that she wants. And this is no longer something to dismiss. It's just sort of the fringe or the noise of the party. I mean, this will become the firmament of it.
Mark, you've written, let's say, unflatteringly about Kevin McCarthy. How do you imagine a Kevin McCarthy speakership might look? What could we expect from that?
I think he will be led around by the nose by the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Jim Jordans of the House, and the Donald Trumps and Ron DeSantis's of, the presidential field. I mean, I can't imagine it would be fun. Kevin McCarthy believes that if he wins the speakership, if Republicans win the majority, and then he can sort of hold off any resistance there is, and if he wins by enough so that he will have the votes, he'll be Speaker of the House for probably about 2 years, right? And he will be able to dine out his entire life as a speaker or former speaker, and that will redeem everything because people have doubted him. I can't imagine they will get a lot done. I can't imagine. I imagine he'll get a lot of abuse, both certainly from Democrats, but certainly from his own party. I can't imagine it would be sort of a coherent governing strategy that he would be able to codify in any way. But look, he'd be speaker. He'd have the gavel. He'd have like great pictures.
Lord knows he has tried.
He's tried. I mean, and he's been close. 2015 after John Boehner quit, he said, he basically spoke too candidly, and he said, when we were doing this Benghazi investigation, we got Hillary Clinton's negatives down, and we really sort of made her less popular. And it sounds kind of quaint now, right? But
it's astonishing looking back on that damaged him. It would be very clear.
Well, I mean, just the other day he said we're going to throw the economy into greater turmoil. I mean, to me, that's too much it's probably true, but it's also candid, and it's the kind of thing that you would theoretically, 7 years ago could have gotten him in a lot of trouble and could have lost him a lot of support within the caucus. But again, I mean, one thing that survival, the levels of survival that Donald Trump has managed, and the things that he's gotten away with, has in some ways trickled down to those who work so hard to enable him, and no one has put more sweat equity into trying to enable and ingratiate himself to Donald Trump than Kevin McCarthy, except for possibly Lindsey Graham and maybe a few others. But I don't know. Look, what kind of speaker will he be? I don't think that he will be one of the great speakers in history. But look, he'll get the gavel. He might even get his name on an airline terminal at the Bakersfield airport, or maybe the entire airport for
A questioner points out we've sort of danced a little bit around the central question we have for this event, which is what is at stake. So let me put that to you each directly. Elaina, what is at stake in this midterm election?
Oh gosh, I have to answer first. That's a really big question. I hate to sound kind of trite when I say this, but I do think free and fair elections they are at stake. And I don't mean to sound like hashtag resistance or hyperbolic or anything like that. But as much as I've just become, fixated on learning more about these sort of more insidious, low-key efforts to install secretaries of state of a certain belief in states across the country, and knowing more about, how likely Kevin McCarthy is to just sort of fold when Marjorie Taylor Greene comes in and says, I'm ready to impeach Joe Biden, or I'm ready to reinvestigate the election, or something like that. How he will go along with something like that. At least with Paul Ryan in the past, you at least had the sense that he would at least nominally push back on something like that, even if the outcome may have been slightly the same. With Kevin McCarthy, I think you cannot rest easy at night feeling that he might at least try to act like the responsible Republican or something like that. I mean, that's just gone. So when it comes to elections, I do think they are at stake in terms of what happens and who gains power.
Right. I would say, Bill Clinton's always saying that elections are about the future, and we try to sort of project into the future what could happen and what it might look like. What I can't help but think is that this election is also about the recent past, and beginning, say, from the beginning of 2021, or beginning with the last election, in that if Republicans win the House and the Senate, but start with the House, about 150 representatives who voted against certification of Joe Biden's election will be vindicated. I mean, that will be fine, right? Not to mention, the sort of memory holding of January 6th and so forth. I mean, I remember right after January 6th, Andy Kim, a Democrat of New Jersey, put out a long Facebook post in which he said, he talked about his experience on January 6th, and he said that there was such unity of purpose in both parties. It was a rare moment where, he actually thought that the fever would break and so forth. He said that the really chilling thing that happened on that day was not so much that, these insurgents stormed the Capitol and the president, directed them to, and people died and there were a lot of injuries and so forth. But what was really chilling was that it reverted back to business as usual, within hours, and hundreds, or 150 or so Republicans voted against certification, knowing full well, what had happened, what had been unleashed, and also just knowing, just from talking to enough Republicans over the last several months, how much they are voting out of fear. Literal fear of physical, retribution and their family's safety. I mean, I wouldn't underestimate, and again, this is the definition of fascism. It's not politics by argument. It's not politics by even politics. It's politics by fear of intimidation. It's politics of fear of the mob. It's politics of, having to worry about things that in a civilized society, politicians didn't traditionally worry about. So to me, that's all very chilling. And it, might sound backwards looking, but we don't seem to be trending in a good direction. And I do worry that the election in a few weeks is going to perpetuate that in a way that, that underscores that we might be at a point, that is very, very troubling.
Well, that's
David,
yeah.
I would add one more thing, which is a bit more forward casting. I think if Republicans win the House in an absolute rout, there is no doubt anymore that Donald Trump runs for president, and he is very much like the instantiated leader of the party, because it will be kind of every affirmation that anyone would need that his version of the Republican Party remains incredibly popular among Republican voters. I think if Republicans were not to do so well, there would be a bit more kind of ambiguity about his own future. But I think if there's very much a red wave, his future, at least in presidential campaigns, is pretty certain.
Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. I think it's a great place to leave it. There's a lot more we could cover, but we don't have time, unfortunately. Mark and Elaina, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of that today. If you have enjoyed this conversation and you want more of The Atlantic, I encourage you to support our journalism by becoming a subscriber. If you're already a subscriber, thank you. Make sure you auto-renew. We have a couple upcoming Atlantic Live events, the Education Summit in DC and People versus Cancer in New York City. You can find out more about those and register to attend virtually or in person using the links in the chat. And otherwise, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for watching. Thanks, David.
And thanks for the questions.
Yeah.